Tonight, we're going further back than monuments, further back than kings, further back than anything most people imagine when they think of ancient history. We're entering a time that exists at the very edge of human memory, a time preserved not in stone or metal, but in clay, soft tablets pressed with symbols, while civilization itself was still learning how to exist. Long before pyramids pierced the Egyptian skyline, before the Sphinx gazed across the sands, before empires, before dynasties, before written law as we understand it today. These were the first attempts humanity ever made to explain existence itself. Not who ruled, not who conquered, but why there was something instead of nothing. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Lower the lights. Let the world quiet down. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. This is not fast history. This is deep time, and it rewards patience. If you're watching this and it resonates with you, you can support the journey by liking and subscribing, but only if it truly speaks to you. And if you feel inclined, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. There's something powerful about knowing that people across the globe are listening to the same ancient stories at the same moment, separated by distance but connected by curiosity. Because curiosity is what brought us here. Tonight, we are not exploring speculation. We are not chasing modern theories. We are not filtering ancient voices through contemporary fantasies. We are listening to what the earliest texts actually say. Before the Anunnaki became internet mythology, before ancient astronaut narratives reshaped these stories into tales of spacecraft and genetic engineering, before television networks decided mystery was more valuable than accuracy, the clay tablets speak for themselves. And if we're willing to listen carefully, they tell a story far older and far stranger than modern myths allow. The Sumerian texts do not begin with gods descending from the sky in shining machines. They do not begin with advanced technology or interstellar travel. They do not begin with humanity as an engineered workforce. They begin with something far more fundamental. They begin before time had structure, before space had direction, before existence had form. According to the earliest Sumerian scribes, there was once a state of being that cannot easily be described using modern language. A moment before moments, a condition before conditions. There was no sky, no earth, no above or below, only an endless expanse without boundary. They called it Namu. Namu was not a goddess in the later sense, no face, no body, no throne. She was not imagined as human-like or even personal. Namu was the primordial sea. The limitless waters that existed before creation itself understood what it was becoming. This was not water as we experience it, flowing rivers, rain falling from clouds, cups filled and emptied. This was water as potential, water as origin, water as the substance from which all reality would eventually take shape. For the Sumerians, this idea was not abstract philosophy. It was rooted in daily survival. They lived between two unpredictable rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Rivers that could nourish life or erase it overnight. Rivers whose floods brought fertile soil or devastating ruin depending on timing and intensity. Water determined whether crops thrived or failed, whether cities flourished or starved, whether life continued at all. So when they imagined the origin of everything, they imagined water first, before gods, before land, before breath. Namu existed alone, not lonely, not lacking, complete within herself. She required no partner, no divine counterpart, no cosmic marriage to initiate creation. This is one of the most striking features of early Sumerian cosmology. In many later traditions, creation begins with a pairing, a male and female principle joining together to generate the world, sky and earth, father and mother. But here, in the earliest layers of Mesopotamian thought, creation begins with a singular source. Namu contained all possibilities within herself. From this primordial sea emerged the first distinctions. Heaven and earth took shape not as places but as principles, and was the sky, Kai was the earth, At first they were not separate. Heaven and earth were fused together in a single mass, inseparable and undivided. There was no space between them, no atmosphere, no realm where movement or life could occur. Everything existed, but nothing could happen. All potential remained locked inside this cosmic embrace. The Sumerian texts describe this early state with language that suggests both physical closeness and metaphysical unity. Heaven and earth were not merely touching, they were one. And yet nothing could grow. For creation to proceed, something had to break. That force was Enlil. Enlil's name is often translated as Lord of the Air, but air here does not simply mean wind. It means breath, space, movement, the invisible realm between things. Enlil did not gently separate heaven and earth. He forced them apart. With immense power, he drove the sky upward and pressed the earth downward. This violent separation created something entirely new, the space between heaven and earth. The atmosphere, the realm where clouds could form, where storms could rage, where birds could fly, where humans would one day breathe. This moment marks the true beginning of the ordered cosmos in Sumerian thought. Creation was not peaceful, it was disruptive, transformative, irreversible. Once heaven and earth were separated, reality could finally unfold. Above was the sky, unreachable and eternal, home to the sun, moon, and stars that govern time itself. Below was the earth, solid and fertile, the foundation upon which cities and fields would one day rise. And between them was the air, the invisible but essential realm of wind, weather, and breath. This three-part structure became the basic architecture of the universe as the Sumerians understood it. But beneath the earth, another realm existed, a realm just as ancient as the sky, the Abzu. The Abzu was the deep freshwater ocean beneath the ground, an endless subterranean sea from which all springs, wells, and rivers were believed to originate. This was not the underworld of the dead, but a life-giving depth, a hidden source of fertility and renewal. And it was ruled by Enki. Enki was the god of wisdom, creativity, and clever solutions. Where Enlil was forceful and commanding, Enki was subtle and adaptive. He was the god who understood how things worked. The Sumerians believed their world quite literally rested on water, and in a sense they were right. The Mesopotamian plain has an extremely high water table. Dig deep enough anywhere and water appears. This observation shaped their cosmology. The land floated above the waters. Civilization rested on a fragile balance. And beneath it all flowed the same primordial substance that existed before creation began. Enki's city was Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city in the world. His temple was believed to stand directly above the point where the Abzu touched the surface, where the boundary between realms was thin. When priests performed rituals there, they believed they were standing at the very axis of existence, where the ordered world met the primordial deep. And it was here, in this carefully balanced cosmos, that the next great question emerged: who would do the work? With the structure of the cosmos finally established, a new problem emerged, one that the earliest texts describe with surprising honesty. The universe, now divided into heaven, earth, and the space between them, required constant effort to maintain. Water had to be guided. Land had to be shaped. Order did not sustain itself. And at first it was the gods who did the work. They dug channels to direct water across the plains. They raised embankments to keep floods from swallowing the land. They packed clay into bricks. They piled earth into foundations. The labor was relentless. These were not the great ruling gods seated in distant authority. These were the lesser divine beings, junior gods tasked with the physical maintenance of creation, and they were exhausted. The texts describe them groaning beneath the weight of their duties, complaining openly, weeping as they worked. Their suffering was not symbolic. It was real within the story, and it threatened the stability of the newly ordered cosmos. Eventually, their frustration reached a breaking point. They gathered together, no longer willing to endure endless labor, and their cries rose upward through the air. the same air Enlil had created to the attention of the higher gods. But Enki, the god most capable of solving such a crisis, was not listening. He slept. Deep beneath the earth in the Abzu, Enki rested in the fresh waters of the primordial deep, unaware that the cosmic balance was beginning to fracture. It was Namu who intervened. The ancient texts tell us that Namu collected the tears of the laboring gods. She gathered their anguish and brought it to her son. She entered the Abzu and woke Enki from his sleep. Her words were direct. "How can you lie there resting," she demanded, "while the gods suffer beneath their burdens?" While creation itself strains under the weight of its own existence, Enki listened. And what followed was one of the most consequential decisions ever recorded in human memory. Rather than forcing the gods back to work, rather than reshaping the cosmos again, rather than undoing creation itself, Enki proposed something entirely new. Create beings who could take on the labor, not gods, something else. Something formed from the earth itself, humanity. The texts describe the creation of humans not as a single flawless act, but as a collaborative process involving multiple divine figures. Namu provided the primordial substance. Enki provided wisdom and design, and the birth goddess, known variously as Ninma, Ninhursag, or Nintu, oversaw the act of bringing life into form. The material used was clay, but not ordinary clay. It was taken from the top of the Abzu, from the same cosmic waters that existed before the sky and earth were separated. Clay infused with primordial essence. This detail matters. Humanity was not formed from a lesser or corrupted substance. Humans were shaped from the same foundational material as the gods themselves. What separated gods and humans was not origin, but degree. The birth goddess pinched pieces of this sacred clay and shaped them into forms. Through ritual actions that the text describes in deliberately obscure language, mixing divine essence, breath, and substance, humans came into being. Their purpose was clear. They would dig the canals. They would tend the fields. They would raise the temples. Human beings were created to take over the labor that the gods could no longer bear. This is where modern interpretations often go astray. There is no mention of genetic manipulation, no reference to mining operations, no suggestion of technological experimentation. The creation of humanity is framed as sacred craftsmanship, guided by necessity, shaped by trial and error, and rooted in divine compassion for exhausted gods. And the process was not perfect. The text known as Enki and Ninma reveals something extraordinary about how the Sumerians understood creation. After humanity proved capable of performing labor, Enki and Ninma entered into a kind of divine contest. They began creating humans with unusual conditions. One was blind, another unable to walk, another incapable of speaking. Each new form presented a challenge, and each time Enki demonstrated his ingenuity by assigning them meaningful roles within society. The blind became musicians. The paralyzed were given honored positions. Those who could not labor were integrated rather than discarded. This story tells us something profound. Creation was not seen as a static, perfect event. It was dynamic, experimental, adaptive. The gods learned, they adjusted, they solved problems. Humanity was not designed as a uniform tool, but as a diverse community capable of many functions beyond simple labor. Once humans took over the work of maintaining the land, the gods were finally able to rest. But humanity, newly created, was not yet civilized. They existed, but barely. According to another early Sumerian text, the world at this stage was still harsh and undeveloped. There was no grain growing in fields, no domesticated animals, no textiles, no structured economy. Humans wandered naked, they ate wild plants, they drank from ditches and streams. They lived little better than animals. This was not because they lacked intelligence, it was because they lacked knowledge. And once again the gods intervened. Grain and sheep were introduced, not as discoveries but as gifts. Divine beings embodied these essentials of civilization and delivered them to humanity. Agriculture transformed existence. For the first time, humans could produce surplus. They could store food. They could specialize labor. Cities became possible. This moment marks the true beginning of civilization in Sumerian thought, not the creation of humans, but the transmission of knowledge. And with civilization came order. Enki, surveying the world, recognized that creation now required management. Everything had a role. Every domain needed oversight. So the gods were assigned responsibilities. One oversaw rivers. Another governed crops. Another protected flocks. Another guided craftsmanship. Another watched over law and justice. The universe became a structured system, a divine administration ensuring balance. And within this system, a new class of gods emerged. They were not creators. They were not laborers. They were judges. The Anunnaki. But their story does not begin here. Their role would only become clear once humanity crossed a far darker threshold. Long before humanity began recording its own history, the Sumerians believed the world passed through an age unlike anything that followed. This was not the world of ordinary time. It was an era that existed between creation and memory, a phase when the distance between gods and humans was far thinner than it would ever be again. According to the oldest traditions, once humanity had been created and civilization had begun to take shape, kingship itself entered the world. Not gradually, not through trial and conquest, but suddenly. Kingship, the texts say, descended from heaven. This phrase does not describe an object falling from the sky or a god physically arriving on earth. It describes authority itself being established as a divine institution. Rule was not a human invention. It was a sacred trust granted by the gods. The first city to receive this gift was Eridu. Already ancient in memory, already sacred because of Enki's temple above the Abzu, Eridu became the starting point of organized rule. And from there, kingship moved from city to city across the land. But these earliest kings were not like later rulers. They belonged to a different category of existence. The Sumerian king list preserves their names, and with them, reigns so long they challenge comprehension. Tens of thousands of years assigned to a single ruler. Lifespans that dwarf all of recorded history. 8 kings, 5 cities, more than 200,000 years. Modern readers often struggle with these numbers. Scholars debate their meaning, symbolic, mathematical, theological. But what matters is not whether these reigns were meant literally. What matters is what they represent. These rulers lived in mythic time, a period when reality itself operated under different rules. In this age, the boundary between divine and human was not yet fixed. Kings were not fully mortal in the later sense. They were beings who stood closer to the gods, bridges between realms. They governed not just land, but order itself. Each city carried a specific meaning. Eridu was the city of beginnings, rooted in the primordial waters. Bad Tabira was associated with craft and metalwork, the transformation of raw material into tools. Larak held mysteries now largely lost to time. Sipar was linked to the sun, to justice, to truth revealed by light. Shurapak stood at the threshold, the last city before the world changed forever. These cities were not merely settlements. They were sacred nodes in the cosmic landscape, prototypes of civilization itself. But this age could not last. Humanity flourished, fields expanded, cities grew dense, voices filled the land, and the gods noticed. The texts describe a growing tension between divine order and human success. Humanity had fulfilled its purpose too well. The work was done. The land was productive. Civilization thrived, but with success came noise. The sounds of daily life, markets, construction, ritual, celebration rose into the air. The same air Enlil ruled, the same air that carried breath and wind and storm, and the gods could not rest. Enlil, lord of the air and authority over the earthly realm, grew increasingly disturbed. The constant clamor of human existence reached even the divine spaces. Sleep became impossible. councils were called, and a decision was made. Humanity would be erased. This choice was not framed as punishment for moral failure. The texts do not accuse humans of corruption or sin. They had not broken divine law. They were simply too many, too active, too present. The solution was total. A flood would wash away the cities, the fields, the people. The world would return to silence. But once again, Enki refused to accept the decision. Bound by divine law, he could not openly oppose the decree. A decision spoken in the divine assembly could not be undone, so he found another way. Enki chose a man, Ziusudra, king of Shurapak, a ruler from the final city of the old age. Through dreams, through whispered words spoken to walls, Enki delivered his warning. A flood was coming. Life would end, but survival was possible. Instructions were given. Build a vessel, seal it. Gather living creatures, preserve the seed of the world. Ziusudra obeyed. When the storm arrived, it was absolute. Winds converged. Waters rose. The familiar world disappeared beneath waves. The cities of civilization vanished. For days and nights, chaos returned. Then silence. When the waters receded, Ziusudra emerged into a transformed world. The sun shone again, the land reappeared, and the first act after survival was worship. Offerings were made, smoke rose, the gods were fed. Even after destruction, reverence remained. When Enlil discovered that humanity had survived, his fury was immense. But Enki stood firm. Humanity was necessary. Total annihilation would undo creation itself. A compromise followed. Humans would continue, but not as before. Lifespans would shorten. Mortality would become absolute. Population would be limited through hardship, illness, and loss. The mythic age ended. History began. Ziusudra was removed from the world of mortals and granted life in a distant paradise. A place beyond suffering. A place between worlds. And with that, the old order passed. Now the Anunnaki emerge clearly in the record. Not as creators, not as benefactors, but as arbiters. They became judges of fate, authorities of the underworld, the final voices determining destiny. They did not shape humanity, they judged it. They did not found civilization, they governed its limits. And in the shadows of this new world, the Anunnaki waited. With the flood behind them and the old world erased, existence entered a new phase, one governed by stricter boundaries and harsher rules. The separation between gods and humans, once thin and permeable, became fixed. Mortality was no longer negotiable. Lifespans shortened. Death became inevitable. And beyond death lay a realm every human would eventually face, the underworld. In Sumerian thought, the underworld was not a place of punishment or reward. It was not heaven or hell in any moral sense. It was simply where the dead went, all of them, kings and laborers, priests and farmers, the righteous and the cruel. Death erased distinction. This realm was known as Kur, the land of no return, a vast subterranean domain beneath the earth, cut off from sunlight, warmth, and abundance. Those who entered it lived on dust and clay. They wore feathers like birds. They moved through shadows. Joy did not exist there, but neither did torture. It was bleak, final, and unavoidable. And presiding over this realm were powerful divine authorities. This is where the Anunnaki truly belong. They were not sky gods. They were not creators. They were not bringers of technology. They were judges. The texts describe them as a collective, solemn, ancient, and unyielding. Often numbered as 7, they sat in assembly to determine fate itself. Once a soul crossed into Kur, it stood before them, and their decision could not be reversed. Even the greatest gods were subject to this law. The clearest example comes from one of the most powerful myths ever recorded in Mesopotamian literature, the descent of Inanna. Inanna was no minor deity. She ruled love and war, fertility and destruction. She embodied both creation and chaos. Her influence extended across heaven and earth, yet even she was not beyond judgment. When Inanna chose to descend into the underworld, she did not arrive in triumph. She was stripped of power step by step. At each gate, she surrendered a symbol of her authority, her crown, her jewelry, her garments. By the time she reached the throne of the underworld, she stood naked and powerless. And there the Anunnaki watched. They did not negotiate. They did not hesitate. They fixed their gaze upon her, the gaze of death. Inanna was struck down and hung like a corpse. For 3 days she remained lifeless, proof that even divinity had limits. Only through Enki's intervention was she rescued, and even then balance demanded a price. Another life had to take her place. This story tells us everything we need to know about the Anunnaki. They were not inventors. They were not explorers. They were not benevolent teachers. They were enforcers of cosmic law. They governed the boundary no one could escape. Their power was not technological, it was metaphysical. They ruled over fate itself. This role places them firmly within the underworld, not the stars. And yet, in modern times, their image has been radically transformed. In the late 20th century, a new narrative emerged, one that would reshape public perception of the Anunnaki entirely. According to this reinterpretation, the Anunnaki were no longer judges of the dead. They became visitors from another planet, advanced beings from a distant world, masters of genetic science, architects of human evolution. This version of the story claimed that they arrived on Earth long before recorded history, that they mined gold, that they altered human DNA to create a labor force. But this narrative does not come from the tablets, it comes from mistranslation. At the center of this reinterpretation is a single claim, that the word Anunnaki means those who came down from heaven to earth. It does not. In the Sumerian language, the term refers to lineage, not location. It identifies the Anunnaki as descendants of the sky god, offspring, divine nobility. Every reputable dictionary confirms this. There is no reference to spacecraft, no implication of extraterrestrial origin, no suggestion of planetary travel. The Anunnaki were born into the cosmos, not visitors to it. Claims of gold mining collapse under scrutiny. The texts never describe gods extracting minerals from the earth. Gold appears only as decoration, tribute, and sacred material, never as an objective. No tablets describe spaceports. No inscriptions record alien technology. No archaeological evidence supports advanced machines. Even the planet said to be their home, Nibiru, does not exist as described. In Mesopotamian texts, the term refers to a crossing point, often associated with a star or celestial position, not a rogue planet. Astronomy itself rejects the idea entirely. A planet with such an orbit would disrupt the solar system. It would be visible. It would leave evidence. There is none. What remains, then, is not a hidden truth suppressed by scholars, but a modern myth built on misunderstanding and imagination. And yet, the real Sumerian story is no less powerful. It tells of humanity shaped from primordial substance, of civilization born from divine knowledge, of gods who argued, erred, and adapted, of a universe maintained through balance rather than perfection, and of judges who waited beyond death, not to punish or reward, but to finalize destiny. The Anunnaki were never our creators. They were our reckoning. So if the ancient texts never describe visitors from the stars, if they never speak of alien engineers or interplanetary mining operations, then why has this modern version of the story taken hold so firmly? Why has the image of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials become so widespread, so persistent, and so resistant to correction? Part of the answer lies in access. The Sumerian language is long dead. Its writing system is complex, unfamiliar, and intimidating. The tablets themselves are fragmented, damaged, scattered across museums and collections around the world. Very few people can read them directly. For most of us, the ancient world comes filtered through translation. And translation always involves trust. We trust that the person doing the translating understands the language, the culture, and the context. We trust that they are not reshaping the text to fit a preconceived story. We trust that uncertainty is acknowledged rather than concealed. When that trust is broken, an entirely new mythology can be created. In the 20th century, one individual claimed to possess special insight into these ancient texts. He presented himself not as a scholar bound by academic conventions, but as an outsider who could see what experts had missed or refused to acknowledge. He claimed the tablets contained hidden knowledge, that they described advanced science, that they encoded astronomical data, that they recorded events humanity was never meant to remember. This approach was compelling because it promised revelation. It suggested that ordinary people had been misled, that institutions were hiding the truth, that ancient wisdom was being suppressed. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in this case, the evidence does not exist. When professional Assyriologists examined these interpretations, they found repeated errors. Words mistranslated, grammatical structures ignored, context stripped away. Sumerian is not a symbolic code that can be freely reinterpreted. It is a language with rules, patterns, and constraints. Its vocabulary is well documented. Its grammar is understood. You cannot simply decide a word means something else because it suits a theory. And yet, that is precisely what happened. Individual signs were isolated from sentences. Poetic imagery was treated as literal description. Metaphor became machinery. Myth became misplaced technology. Winged symbols were labeled spacecraft. Divine crowns were called helmets. Stars became planets. One famous seal was even presented as a diagram of the solar system, despite ignoring basic astronomical order and well-established artistic conventions. To specialists, these claims were immediately recognizable as false, but to the general public they were intriguing. They offered mystery instead of nuance, drama instead of complexity, certainty instead of ambiguity, and perhaps most importantly, they offered a story in which humanity was not responsible for its own civilization. If aliens built our cities, then human achievement becomes less fragile. If gods engineered us, then our flaws feel designed rather than accidental. If knowledge came from outside, then human history becomes a story of inheritance rather than struggle. This is comforting. The real Sumerian worldview is far less reassuring. It tells us that humans were created to work. That civilization exists because labor was transferred downward, that the gods were not moral guardians but administrators of balance. That catastrophe could occur not because of evil, but because of inconvenience. In this worldview, the universe is not structured around human importance. Humans exist because they are useful. They survive because they are tolerated. They die because death maintains order. There is no promise of salvation, no eternal reward, no final justice, only continuity. Even the gods are constrained by hierarchy, by law, by consequence. This may be why the ancient astronaut narrative feels more attractive. It restores intention. It replaces indifference with design. It gives humanity a cosmic origin story that feels purposeful. But purpose is not what the Sumerian texts offer. They offer explanation. They offer insight into how one of the earliest civilizations made sense of existence in an unpredictable world shaped by floods, droughts, and fragile survival. They reflect a society that understood life as precarious, that saw order as something that had to be maintained constantly, that recognized how easily creation could slip back into chaos. The gods in these texts are not perfect beings. They argue, they make mistakes, they regret decisions, they compromise. They are powerful, but not absolute. And humans, shaped from clay and divine essence, stand between realms, neither animal nor God, neither eternal nor insignificant, bound to labor, bound to death, bound to ritual. The Anunnaki in this framework are not architects of humanity's rise, but reminders of its limits. They sit at the edge of existence. They wait where breath ends. They determine what cannot be appealed. They are not our creators. They are what comes after. To understand how the Sumerians saw the Anunnaki, humanity, and themselves, we have to understand how they believed the universe was arranged, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but structurally. In Sumerian thought, existence was layered. Reality was not a single open expanse. It was divided into realms stacked vertically, each with its own rules, inhabitants, and dangers. At the highest level was the sky. This was not simply empty space above the earth. It was a solid, ordered realm, a vast dome arching over the world. The sky was the domain of authority, the place from which power descended. The sun moved across it. The moon marked time within it. The stars traced patterns that governed seasons and ritual. This upper realm was distant. Humans could see it but never reach it. It was the home of the highest gods, beings whose decisions shaped reality but who rarely intervened directly. Below the sky was the earth. This was the realm of visibility, sound, and action. The place where crops grew, cities rose, and people lived out their brief lives. The earth was not inert. It was alive, fertile, and sacred. It was also fragile. The Sumerians lived on flat land with no natural defenses against flooding. Their cities depended entirely on irrigation systems that required constant maintenance. One mistake, one unexpected storm, could destroy years of labor. Because of this, the earth was seen as something that had to be actively managed. Order did not persist on its own. Below the earth lay another realm entirely, the deep. Beneath the soil, beneath foundations and roots, stretched an endless expanse of freshwater, the Abzu. This was not imagined as dark or hostile. It was ancient, powerful, and essential. From it came springs. From it came rivers. From it came fertility. The Abzu was the source of life, but also a reminder of chaos. If the balance failed, its waters could rise and erase everything built above them. This realm belonged to Enki. He governed the flow of water, the distribution of knowledge, and the mechanisms that allowed civilization to function. His wisdom was practical rather than absolute. He did not command from above. He intervened from within. And beneath even the Abzu lay the final realm, the land of the dead. This was not simply another layer of earth. It was a separate domain, sealed off from the living world. Once entered, there was no return. The underworld was not aligned with morality. It did not reward virtue or punish wrongdoing. It simply received the dead. Every soul went there. Existence in this realm was diminished. Life continued, but without vitality. The dead existed in shadow, sustained only by offerings made by the living above, and ruling over this realm were its judges. This is where the Anunnaki held authority. They were not omnipresent, they were not everywhere. They ruled a specific threshold. They governed the moment when life ended. Understanding this structure explains much about Sumerian behavior. It explains why ritual mattered so deeply, why offerings were constant, why temples dominated city centers. The gods were not abstract ideas. They were administrators of reality. Each controlled a domain that could directly affect survival. Failing to honor them was not immoral, it was dangerous. Priests did not pray for salvation. They performed rituals to maintain balance. Kings did not rule by popular will. They acted as stewards of divine order. Every aspect of daily life, from planting crops to building walls to resolving disputes, was embedded in this cosmic framework. This worldview also shaped how the Sumerians understood time. They did not see history as a straight line progressing toward improvement. They saw it as cyclical, fragile, always at risk of collapse. Creation had already failed once. The flood proved that. What existed now was not the original world. It was a revised version, more limited, more constrained, more vulnerable. Human lifespans were shorter. The gods were more distant. Death was final. The memory of the antediluvian age lingered as a reminder of what had been lost, not a paradise of innocence, but a time of proximity, a time when the world was new. In this post-flood reality, humanity occupied a narrow space between forces far beyond its control. Too much success invited destruction. Too much failure invited collapse. Survival required balance, and balance required obedience to tradition, to ritual, to inherited knowledge. This is why the past mattered so much to the Sumerians, why ancient kings were remembered, why origins were preserved in lists and hymns and myths. To forget the structure of the cosmos was to invite chaos. And this, perhaps more than anything else, explains why later reinterpretations struggle to fit. The Sumerian universe was not designed to flatter humanity. It did not place humans at the center. It did not promise ultimate meaning. It did not offer escape. It offered continuity. And at the boundaries of that continuity stood the Anunnaki, silent, watchful, unyielding. As centuries passed and cities rose and fell, the Sumerian world did not remain isolated. Languages shifted. Populations moved. Power changed hands. But the stories endured. New cultures inherited the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, and with them, the myths that explained how the world came to be. These traditions were not erased. They were reshaped. The Sumerians were eventually absorbed into a broader cultural landscape dominated by Akkadian-speaking peoples. Later still, Babylon would emerge as a center of political and intellectual life. And as these transitions occurred, the old myths evolved. They were rewritten in new languages. They were reorganized to reflect new hierarchies. They were adjusted to suit new theological priorities. But their foundations remained unmistakable. The primordial waters still existed. Heaven and earth were still separated. The gods were still born into a structured cosmos. Humanity was still created to serve divine needs, and catastrophe still marked the boundary between ages. One of the clearest examples of this transformation is found in the Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish. In this later version of the story, the primal waters are no longer unified. They are divided into two beings, one representing fresh water, the other salt water. From their mingling, the gods are born. Conflict replaces emergence. Violence replaces separation. A younger god rises to power through conquest. This reflects Babylon's political reality. Where Sumerian mythology emphasized balance and administration, Babylonian theology emphasized kingship, dominance, and centralized authority. The gods began to resemble empires. Creation itself became a struggle for control. Even the flood story was revised. The hero received a new name. The vessel took on different proportions. The motivations of the gods shifted slightly, but the core remained. Humanity multiplied. The gods were disturbed. A deluge was unleashed. One man was warned. Life survived. These stories spread far beyond Mesopotamia. Through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange, they traveled westward and southward. They reached the Levant. They entered the traditions of other peoples. Echoes appear in later texts. A garden watered by rivers, a flood that destroys the world, a chosen survivor, a covenant after catastrophe. These similarities are not coincidences. They reflect a shared inheritance, a web of stories passed down, adapted, and reinterpreted over millennia. But as these myths traveled, something changed. The gods grew more distant. Divine councils became less visible. Judgment shifted from cosmic balance to moral evaluation. Eventually, in later monotheistic traditions, the many gods were replaced by one. The flood became a moral reckoning rather than a response to inconvenience. Creation became deliberate and final rather than experimental. Humanity's role shifted from servant to steward. In this transformation, much was gained. But something was lost. The earlier worldview, where gods could argue, where decisions had consequences even for divine beings, where creation was fragile, faded into the background. The Sumerian universe was uncomfortable because it offered no certainty, no guarantee that good behavior would be rewarded, no promise that suffering had meaning, no assurance that catastrophe could be avoided. Later traditions would seek those assurances, but the earliest texts did not. They asked different questions. How is order maintained? What happens when balance fails? How do humans survive in a world they did not design? These questions remained relevant even as names changed and languages evolved. And yet, as centuries passed, the original context of these stories became increasingly difficult to recover. Clay tablets cracked, libraries burned, knowledge fragmented. By the time modern scholars began deciphering cuneiform in the 19th century, much had already been lost. What remained was partial. Broken lines, missing sections, ambiguous phrases, and into these gaps imagination rushed in. The less complete the record became, the easier it was to project modern ideas backward: technology, aliens, hidden knowledge. But the fragments we do have, when read carefully, tell a consistent story, not of visitors from the stars, but of humans trying to understand forces they could not control, not of advanced science, but of early attempts to explain chaos, survival, and loss. The Sumerians did not write these myths to deceive future generations. They wrote them to preserve memory, to remember floods, to remember hunger, to remember beginnings. And in doing so, they left behind something rare, a record of humanity's first effort to make sense of existence itself. To live in the Sumerian world was to live with constant awareness of forces beyond human control. The gods were not distant abstractions. They were present in every aspect of daily life. When crops failed, it was not chance. When floods came, it was not accident. When disease spread or prosperity arrived, it was not random. Everything had cause, and that cause was divine. This did not mean the gods were always watching individual people. It meant they governed systems: water, weather, fertility, conflict, death. Humans existed within those systems, subject to their fluctuations. Daily life revolved around maintaining balance. Fields were planted according to ritual calendars. Canals were cleaned under priestly supervision. Festivals were timed to celestial movements. Offerings were made not out of devotion alone, but necessity. To neglect ritual was to invite disaster. Temples stood at the center of every city, not merely as places of worship, but as administrative hubs. They stored grain, managed labor, distributed rations, organized trade. The gods owned the land. Humans worked it. Priests served as intermediaries, not moral guides, but technicians of the sacred. They knew which words to speak, which gestures to perform, which omens to read. Kings, too, served a role defined by the cosmos. A ruler was not sovereign by personal right. He was appointed, chosen by the gods to maintain order on their behalf. His success was measured not by conquest alone, but by stability. If floods were controlled, the king was favored. If famine struck, divine displeasure was assumed. This placed immense pressure on leadership. Rulers were expected to repair temples, sponsor rituals, honor traditions older than memory. Innovation was dangerous. Change risked imbalance. The past was authority. This explains why Sumerian texts are filled with lists: kings, cities, offerings, gods. Preservation mattered more than originality. Survival depended on continuity. Humanity's role in this system was not to improve the world, but to sustain it. Progress was not assumed. Collapse was always possible. The flood was never forgotten. It remained a warning etched into memory. Creation could be undone, and death was constant proof. Every person knew where they would go when life ended. There was no hope of escape, no promise of transcendence, only the certainty of the underworld. What mattered was not the afterlife, but remembrance. If the living poured libations, if they spoke the dead's name, if offerings reached the grave, then existence continued faintly. If not, the dead faded further into dust. This belief bound families together across generations. To care for ancestors was not sentiment, it was responsibility. And beyond the living and the dead stood fate, not destiny as choice, but destiny as decree. The Sumerians believed the universe operated according to fixed decisions spoken by the gods. These decrees were not arbitrary. They were the mechanisms that held reality together. Once spoken, they could not be undone. The Anunnaki played a role here as well. They were associated with these decrees, with the fixing of outcomes, not just for individuals, but for cities, kings, and eras. They did not decide lightly. They did not explain themselves. They did not change their minds. To know one's fate was impossible. To resist it was futile. This worldview may seem bleak, but it also offered clarity. Life was not chaotic. Suffering was not meaningless. Everything fit into a structure, even if that structure was indifferent to human comfort. In such a world, meaning was not found in reward. It was found in participation, to work, to perform rituals, to raise children, to honor the gods, to remember the dead. This was enough. And this may be why the Sumerian legacy endures, not because it offers hope, but because it offers honesty. It reflects a civilization that lived on the edge of survival and understood how fragile existence truly was. They did not imagine a universe designed for them. They imagined a universe they had to adapt to, and they left behind a record of that understanding, pressed into clay, baked by time and waiting to be heard. When we step back from the names, the places, and the long lists of gods and kings, a deeper message begins to emerge from these ancient texts. The Sumerians were not trying to predict the future. They were not encoding secret technologies. They were not leaving warnings about alien visitors. They were doing something far more human. They were trying to remember. They lived in a land where everything depended on fragile systems, rivers that could nourish or destroy, soil that could sustain life or turn barren, cities that could rise quickly and vanish just as fast. Nothing felt permanent, so they asked the only questions that mattered. Where did this world come from? Why does order exist at all? What causes it to fail? Their answers were not optimistic, but they were coherent. Existence began in chaos. Order was imposed through force and separation. Maintenance required constant effort, and collapse was always possible. This was not a universe guided by benevolence. It was a universe governed by balance. The gods were not guardians of human happiness. They were custodians of structure. Their concern was not justice in a moral sense, but stability in a cosmic one. Humanity existed within that framework as a functional component, created to work, created to maintain, created to obey inherited patterns. And when those patterns were disrupted by excess, by imbalance, by noise, the system corrected itself, sometimes gently, sometimes catastrophically. The flood was not an anomaly, it was a reset, a reminder that creation could be undone. What followed was not a new beginning, but a constrained continuation. A world with limits imposed to prevent another collapse, shorter lives, fixed mortality, greater distance between divine and human realms. In this world, humans were no longer close to the gods. They served them from below. And overseeing the final boundary, the point no human could cross, stood the Anunnaki, not as conquerors, not as benefactors, but as final authorities. Their presence marked the end of possibility. Once judgment was rendered, nothing changed. This understanding shaped everything. It shaped how the Sumerians governed, how they worshipped, how they mourned, how they remembered. Their cities were not monuments to progress. They were attempts at preservation. Each brick, each ritual, each list of names was an act of resistance against forgetting. Writing itself emerged from this need, not to tell stories, but to track reality, who worked, what was stored, which offerings were made, which gods were honored. Only later did writing turn toward myth and memory, toward recording the very origins that justified the system. In doing so, the Sumerians preserved something invaluable. A record of humanity's first confrontation with impermanence. They did not pretend the world was fair. They did not assume survival was guaranteed. They did not imagine destiny as choice. They faced uncertainty head-on. And perhaps that is why these texts still speak to us, not because they promise answers, but because they refuse illusions. In a time when modern narratives often seek comfort, whether through progress, salvation, or cosmic significance, the Sumerian worldview stands apart. It offers no reassurance, only recognition that existence is delicate, that order requires effort, that memory matters, and that forgetting has consequences. The clay tablets survived not because they were indestructible, but because someone cared enough to preserve them, because scribes copied them again and again, because generations believed the past mattered. They believed that if the origins were forgotten, the structure would fail. And in a sense, they were right. The moment we replace their voices with fantasies, when we overwrite their meaning with stories they never told, we lose what they were trying to pass on. Not secrets, but understanding. Understanding of a world shaped by forces beyond control. Understanding of humanity's place within it. Understanding that meaning does not require comfort to be real. The Sumerians were the first to write, and what they wrote was not about the stars. It was about survival. When we return to the present, when the clay tablets are placed back behind glass and the ancient names begin to fade from memory, something lingers. Not answers, perspective. The Sumerians lived at the beginning of recorded thought. They stood at a threshold humanity would never cross again, the moment when memory first became permanent. Before them, stories lived only as long as voices endured. After them, words could outlast generations. What they chose to record tells us what mattered most. They did not write about personal triumph. They did not glorify individual emotion. They did not seek immortality through legacy. They recorded systems, how the world was structured, how power moved, how balance was kept, how it failed. Their gods were not ideals to aspire toward, they were forces to account for. Their myths were not fantasies, they were explanations grounded in lived experience. Floods happened, cities vanished. Life was fragile. These were not metaphors, they were facts. So the Sumerians built meaning around what they could observe. They accepted limits rather than denying them. They constructed narratives that explained loss as part of existence, not an exception to it. This is why their worldview feels unsettling. It does not place humanity at the center. It does not promise rescue. It does not suggest progress is inevitable. Instead, it insists that survival requires awareness. Awareness of cycles. Awareness of imbalance. Awareness of consequences. Even the gods were not immune. They argued. They erred. They adjusted. Creation itself was provisional. This stands in stark contrast to later traditions that would imagine perfection at the beginning and corruption afterward. The Sumerian story begins with imperfection and manages it. Perhaps this is why modern reinterpretations struggle to leave it intact. It is easier to imagine ancient gods as advanced aliens than to accept a worldview where humanity is neither chosen nor special, only present. It is more comforting to believe civilization was gifted than to accept it was earned through labor and sustained through ritual and repetition. But the truth preserved in the tablets is quieter and heavier. Civilization exists because people work, because they remember, because they maintain what was handed to them. And when they fail to do so, collapse follows. This is not ancient pessimism, it is ancient realism. The Sumerians did not ask whether the universe cared about them, they assumed it did not. And from that assumption, they built a culture capable of enduring for thousands of years. They understood that meaning is not given, it is maintained. Their final lesson is not hidden in mystery or lost knowledge. It is visible in the clay itself, pressed carefully, copied patiently, preserved against time. A reminder that before humanity searched the stars, before it asked whether it was alone in the universe, it first asked how to survive the world beneath its feet. And that question, perhaps more than any other, is still with us. So as this journey ends, let the voices of the earliest scribes fall silent once more. Let the dust settle. Let the waters recede. And remember that long before speculation, before fantasy, before modern myth, there were people who looked at an unpredictable world and chose to understand it rather than escape it. They left us their thoughts, not to impress us, but to warn us, and to remind us that even in silence the past is still speaking, if we're willing to listen. There is a temptation when standing at the edge of deep history to search for something extraordinary hiding behind it, a revelation, a secret, a hidden hand guiding everything forward. But the Sumerian texts offer something different. They offer restraint. They do not exaggerate humanity's importance. They do not inflate human destiny into cosmic centrality. They present a world that does not revolve around us, and never did. In this way, the Sumerians may feel more modern than we expect. They understood that systems matter more than individuals. That survival depends on cooperation, continuity, and memory rather than brilliance or heroism. Their kings were not saviors, their gods were not protectors, their myths were not promises, they were explanations. This is why the tablets are filled with lists, formulas, repetitions. To modern eyes, these may seem tedious, but repetition was the point. Repetition preserved order. Repetition prevented forgetting. Repetition held chaos at bay. Every ritual reenacted creation. Every offering reaffirmed balance. Every copied tablet resisted erosion, both literal and cultural. And erosion was always present. Floodwater erased cities. Time erased names. Silence erased meaning. Only what was remembered survived. This is why the Anunnaki remain so stark in the Sumerian imagination. They do not comfort. They do not teach. They do not intervene. They wait. They represent the final certainty in a world defined by uncertainty. Not death itself, but the end of negotiation. Once fate was fixed, nothing could be undone. In this, the Anunnaki were not villains. They were inevitability. And inevitability was something the Sumerians respected deeply. They did not fear death because it was cruel. They feared it because it was final. So they lived in ways that honored continuity rather than escape. They built cities not to last forever, but to function now. They worshipped gods not for love, but for stability. They recorded the past not for nostalgia, but for survival. This is the core of their legacy. Not mystery, not spectacle, not cosmic drama, but endurance. It is easy to dismiss this worldview as bleak, but it may be more honest than narratives that promise endless progress or ultimate redemption. The Sumerians understood something fundamental. That meaning does not require permanence. That value does not require reward. That survival does not require destiny. It requires attention. Attention to water. Attention to land, attention to balance, attention to memory. And perhaps that is why their voices still reach us, not because they claim to know everything, but because they accepted how little could be controlled. So as we step away from their world, away from the clay tablets, the ancient names, the layered cosmos, what remains is not a theory, it is a posture, a way of looking at existence without illusion. And in that posture the Sumerians still stand, quietly, patiently, at the beginning of recorded time, reminding us that before humanity asked where it was going, it first asked how to endure. And that question has never stopped being relevant. When we consider how much of the Sumerian world has been lost, it is remarkable that anything remains at all. The cities they built were made of mud brick. Their temples rose from river clay. Their homes dissolved back into the earth when abandoned. Stone endures. Clay returns to dust, and yet clay is what carried their thoughts forward. Each tablet was fragile, easily broken, easily erased. But when baked by accident, by fire, by destruction, by catastrophe, it became permanent. Disaster preserved memory. Libraries burned, and in burning they hardened. Cities fell, and in falling they sealed their records beneath layers of soil. What survived did so unintentionally. This alone tells us something profound about the Sumerian worldview. They did not expect immortality. They did not write for eternity. They wrote for necessity, for accounting, for instruction, for continuity. Myth followed function. Only after systems were stable did reflection appear. Only after survival was secured did humanity begin to ask what survival meant. And those answers were never simple. The Sumerians did not believe the universe was improving. They believed it was stabilizing, slowly, imperfectly, and at great cost. Every generation inherited not progress but responsibility. To keep canals clear, to honor gods correctly, to copy texts accurately, to remember what happened before. Mistakes were not abstract, they were fatal. A neglected ritual could mean crop failure. A broken oath could invite divine anger. A forgotten story could unravel order. This is why memory itself became sacred, not emotion, not belief, but recollection. To remember was to resist chaos. And perhaps this is why later civilizations struggled to fully understand Sumerian thought. As power centralized and empires grew, distance from the land increased. Floods became statistics. Famine became logistics. Ritual became ideology. Meaning shifted. But in the earliest layers of Mesopotamian tradition, meaning was never separate from survival. The gods were not metaphors. They were explanations for forces that could not yet be controlled. Rain, disease, death, time. These were not philosophical abstractions. They were daily realities. So the Sumerians built stories that could hold them, stories where creation was difficult, where order was fragile, where catastrophe had precedent, and where humanity's role was modest but essential, not chosen, not exalted, but necessary. The Anunnaki fit into this logic perfectly. They were not creators because creation was already complete. They were not teachers because knowledge had already been given. They were not rulers because authority was already distributed. They were finality. They existed where questions ended. This made them terrifying not because they were cruel but because they were absolute. And absolutes were rare in the Sumerian universe. Everything else could be negotiated, appeased, adjusted. Death could not. So death became the ultimate organizing principle. It shaped ethics, family structure, ritual obligation, and historical memory. It placed urgency on the present and weight on tradition. To live was to manage time wisely. To die was to enter silence. To be remembered was to exist a little longer. And in this understanding, the Sumerians were not pessimists. They were realists. They accepted limits and built within them. And perhaps that is why their civilization, though long gone, still feels close, because their concerns were not so different from ours. Uncertainty, fragility, the fear of collapse, the desire to preserve meaning. They did not escape these concerns with fantasy. They faced them, and they wrote them down. As the noise of the ancient cities fades, what remains is silence, not emptiness but stillness. The kind of quiet that follows catastrophe, the quiet after floodwaters recede, the quiet that settles over abandoned streets and collapsed walls. This silence mattered to the Sumerians. They understood that silence was not the absence of life, but its boundary. It was the state that existed before creation and the condition that followed destruction. Silence was what Namu emerged from, and silence was what the flood returned the world to. Between those two silences, life happened, briefly. The Sumerians did not romanticize this interval. They measured it, they recorded it, they tried to stabilize it. Time was not infinite. Time was fragile. Every generation lived with the awareness that what existed now could disappear without warning, that cities were temporary, that names could vanish. So they anchored themselves in repetition. Morning rituals repeated the act of creation. Seasonal festivals mirrored cosmic cycles. Daily labor echoed the original work once performed by the gods. Nothing was accidental. Even rest was regulated. And this constant patterning created a rhythm that gave shape to uncertainty, a rhythm that made life livable despite its limits. The gods were part of this rhythm, not above it. They participated in cycles. They reacted to disruption. They adjusted when balance failed. This is why divine conflict appears so often in Sumerian myth. The gods argued because order required negotiation. Authority alone was not enough. Enlil represented force. Enki represented adaptation. Neither was sufficient by itself. Creation depended on tension. And humanity existed within that tension, not as victims, not as heroes, but as participants. Humans were created to work, yes, but work was not punishment. It was integration. Labor bound humans to the land, to water, to cycles of growth and decay. Through work, humans became part of the system rather than separate from it. This idea is uncomfortable in modern terms. We often imagine meaning as transcendence, escaping limitation, overcoming nature, surpassing origin. The Sumerians imagined meaning as alignment. To live well was to fit correctly within the structure of the world. Excess was dangerous. Neglect was fatal. Balance was survival. Even grief followed this logic. Mourning rituals did not seek closure, they maintained connection. They acknowledged loss without pretending it could be undone. The dead did not disappear, they diminished, and only memory slowed that process. This placed responsibility on the living not to save the dead but to remember them, to speak names, to pour water, to maintain presence. Forgetting was the true death. In this sense, the Anunnaki represent the final forgetting. Once judgment was rendered, nothing more could be done. They did not erase memory, but they ended action. They were the still point, the place where effort stopped. And perhaps that is why they feel so stark, so impersonal, so unyielding in the texts. They were not meant to be loved or feared. They were meant to be accepted. Acceptance was the highest form of wisdom in the Sumerian worldview. Not hope, not belief, but recognition. Recognition of limits. Recognition of cycles. Recognition of impermanence. This is what separates these ancient texts from later traditions that promised redemption or escape. The Sumerians did not imagine a final resolution. They imagined continuity until it failed, and when it failed, it began again, altered and diminished. This may be the most difficult lesson they offer. That survival is not victory. That endurance is not triumph. That existence does not resolve. It continues until it does not. And in that understanding there is a strange calm, a release from expectation, a grounding in what is. The Sumerians did not ask the universe to care about them. They learned how to live without that assurance. And in doing so, they left us not a mystery to solve, but a way of seeing. One that does not promise comfort, but offers clarity. Night in the Sumerian world carried a different weight than it does today. Without artificial light, darkness was complete. The sky became vast. Stars pressed closer. Sounds traveled farther. The heavens were not decorative, they were active. The movements above were watched carefully, not for curiosity but for instruction. Time itself was read in the sky. Months followed the moon. Seasons followed the stars. Rituals followed alignment. Nothing was casual. To misread the heavens was to misstep in the world below. This constant observation reinforced a sense that existence unfolded according to patterns older than humanity itself. Patterns that could be studied but never controlled. Even the gods respected them. The sky god did not alter the stars. The moon god did not hasten his cycle. The sun did not linger. Order was not dominance, it was adherence. And humanity learned to do the same. Cities were laid out with cosmic symbolism. Temples aligned with cardinal directions. Sacred spaces mirrored celestial order. Architecture became theology in brick and mud. Every wall carried meaning. Every threshold marked transition. Inside these cities, life unfolded with remarkable discipline. Labor began at dawn. Work followed seasonal rhythms. Festivals punctuated the year not as celebration alone but as recalibration. Each ceremony realigned the human world with the divine one. Without this alignment, the Sumerians believed imbalance would spread. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Small errors accumulated. Neglected rituals compounded. Forgetting crept in. And forgetting was the enemy. The greatest fear was not invasion, not famine, not even death. It was dissolution, the loss of order, the unraveling of meaning, the return to undifferentiated chaos. This fear explains why creation myths begin with separation, why structure mattered so deeply, why boundaries were sacred. Heaven and earth were torn apart so that life could exist. Fresh water was distinguished from salt. Day was separated from night. Difference made existence possible. Confusion ended it. The flood erased difference. Water covered land. Sky merged with earth. Cities vanished. The world became one substance again. And when the waters withdrew, everything had to be rebuilt carefully, cautiously, with memory intact. The post-flood world was narrower. Lives were shorter. Access to gods was reduced. Miracles became rare, but order remained, and that was enough. The Sumerians did not mourn the loss of closeness to the divine. They adapted. They learned new limits. They codified rules. They survived. This survival was not heroic, it was procedural, and that may be the most difficult concept for modern minds to accept. We often look for greatness in rebellion, innovation, transcendence. The Sumerians found it in maintenance, in showing up, in repeating what worked, in honoring what endured. Their myths did not encourage escape. They encouraged continuity. And the Anunnaki, waiting at the end of all stories, reinforced this lesson. No matter how life unfolded, whether prosperous or painful, it would arrive at the same conclusion: judgment, stillness, silence. This certainty did not paralyze them, it focused them, it made every action count. And perhaps that is the final quiet strength of the Sumerian worldview, not that it explains everything, but that it teaches how to live when nothing guarantees success. Time for the Sumerians was not a straight line. It did not move toward improvement. It did not promise resolution. It did not bend toward fulfillment. Time moved in returns. Seasons repeated, floods returned, kings rose and fell, cities emerged and vanished. Even creation itself was not singular. It began, collapsed, and began again, altered, constrained, remembered. This circular understanding shaped how history was recorded. Events were not important because they were unique. They mattered because they fit a pattern. The past was not distant. It was active. Every ritual reenacted an earlier moment. Every law echoed an older decree. Every king stood in the shadow of predecessors stretching back to myth. This is why chronology blurred, years stretched, reigns lengthened, myth and memory intertwined. Accuracy was less important than alignment. To record the past correctly was to preserve structure, not detail. The Sumerians were not historians in the modern sense. They were caretakers of sequence. They understood that once sequence broke, once origins were forgotten, order failed. So they guarded beginnings. They preserved the first city, the first kings, the first gods, the first catastrophe. These origins explained everything that followed. Without them, the present became unmoored. And so the flood remained central, not as punishment but as boundary. Before the flood, existence was different. After the flood, limits applied. This division shaped identity. Humanity understood itself as living in a reduced world, still meaningful, still functional, but narrower than what had come before. This awareness did not inspire despair. It inspired caution. Boundaries were respected, traditions were followed. Innovation was approached carefully. Change was not forbidden, but it was suspect. Every adjustment risked imbalance. The gods themselves demonstrated this. When Enlil acted with force alone, destruction followed. When Enki acted with adaptation, survival emerged. Neither approach was complete by itself. Wisdom lay in knowing when to preserve and when to adjust. This tension defined civilization. Cities expanded, but canals had to be maintained. Populations grew, but rituals had to continue. Wealth accumulated, but offerings were required. Nothing was free. Nothing was permanent. Even power carried obligation. Kings were judged not only by conquest but by stewardship. A ruler who neglected temples or ignored omens endangered everyone. Authority without alignment was dangerous, and alignment required memory. This is why scribes held such importance. They were not artists. They were not philosophers. They were anchors. Their task was repetition without distortion. A single error in a ritual text could disrupt divine favor. A misplaced word could invalidate a ceremony. Accuracy was sacred. To copy a tablet was not clerical work. It was preservation of reality. And through this relentless copying, through generations of careful hands, the Sumerian worldview endured long after the cities themselves fell. Empires replaced city-states. Languages changed. Gods were renamed, but the structure remained. Creation from chaos, order through separation, maintenance through effort, collapse through neglect. This framework echoed into later cultures, Babylonian, Assyrian, even beyond Mesopotamia itself. Though names changed, the bones of the story remained. This is the quiet influence of Sumer, not dominance, not conquest, but inheritance. Their way of seeing became part of how humanity understood itself, and still does. Long after the Sumerian language faded from daily speech, its structure remained embedded in the cultures that followed. Words changed, names shifted, stories adapted, but the underlying shape endured. Later peoples inherited the idea that order must be maintained, not assumed. That chaos was not evil but natural. That civilization existed only as long as effort sustained it. This inheritance was not passed through conquest alone. It traveled through administration, ritual, and habit, through calendars, through laws, through temple routines. Even when Sumerian cities fell silent, their logic continued to operate in new centers of power. Babylon would rise, Assyria would expand, empires would stretch across lands the Sumerians never imagined. Yet beneath their grandeur, the same principles remained. Rivers still demanded management. Agriculture still required coordination. Authority still required legitimacy. And legitimacy still came from the divine. The gods were reinterpreted, reorganized, renamed, but not abandoned. The cosmic order was too useful to discard. Kings continued to rule by heavenly sanction. Priests continued to mediate between worlds. Omen readers continued to watch the skies. Even when myths evolved, their function did not. They explained uncertainty. They justified hierarchy. They preserved continuity. This persistence is easy to overlook when focusing only on dramatic change. But continuity often matters more than transformation. Civilizations do not reset easily. They accumulate. And Sumer was the foundation. Its ideas were not perfect. Its systems were not just. Its gods were not kind. But they were functional. They addressed the realities of life in a volatile environment. They provided structure where none existed naturally. They offered explanations where control was impossible. In doing so, they created something durable. A worldview capable of adapting without dissolving. This adaptability explains why Sumerian thought could be absorbed by later cultures without being erased. It was not rigid. It allowed reinterpretation. The flood became a shared memory across traditions. The creation story was retold with new emphasis. The underworld retained its shadowed permanence. Even the Anunnaki survived in altered forms, sometimes elevated, sometimes diminished, but never forgotten. Their role as judges of fate proved transferable. Every civilization needs an ending. Every worldview needs closure. The Anunnaki provided that. They stood where narrative stopped, where action ceased, where explanation ended. They were not dramatic because drama requires resolution. They were final, and finality in a fragile world brought a kind of peace, not hope, not justice, but certainty. This certainty shaped how people lived. When nothing waits beyond death but silence, the present carries weight. When fate cannot be escaped, choice becomes about alignment rather than outcome. How one lived mattered not because it changed destiny but because it sustained order. This understanding strips away illusion, but it also removes distraction. Life becomes focused. Responsibilities become clear. Memory becomes sacred. This is the inheritance Sumer left behind. Not a prophecy, not a mystery, but a method. A way to endure in an uncertain world. When centuries pass, when languages dissolve and cities sink back into the soil, what survives is rarely intention. What survives is habit. The Sumerians did not plan to influence the future. They were not writing for distant descendants. They were solving immediate problems: how to store grain, how to appease gods, how to rebuild after disaster. And yet those solutions echoed forward. They shaped how power was justified, how history was framed, how memory was structured. Even the idea that civilization could end, that it was not guaranteed, became a lasting inheritance. Later cultures would speak of golden ages, of fallen worlds, of catastrophes that reset existence. These ideas did not emerge in isolation. They were inherited. The Sumerians had already imagined a world that could be undone. They had already recorded its collapse. They had already explained why it happened. Too much noise, too much growth, too much imbalance. Their explanation was not moral, it was systemic. and systems fail when pushed too far. This perspective quietly resists the belief that civilization naturally improves. It suggests instead that stability is temporary, always dependent on maintenance. Neglect invites collapse, excess invites correction, forgetting invites repetition. These were not abstract warnings. They were lessons learned from lived experience. Flood layers in the soil, abandoned temples, rebuilt walls. The landscape itself confirmed the myths, and the myths gave meaning to the landscape. This mutual reinforcement between story and environment anchored Sumerian thought. It made belief inseparable from observation. The gods were not distant because their influence was visible. A failed harvest meant something had gone wrong. A successful year meant balance had been preserved. Every outcome required explanation. Chance was not an option. Even today, this impulse remains familiar. We still search for cause. We still resist randomness. We still build narratives to explain loss. The difference is that the Sumerians did not expect those narratives to comfort them. They expected them to orient them. Orientation mattered more than reassurance. To know where one stood within the cosmos, even if that position was small, was preferable to illusion. This acceptance created resilience. Not optimism, not confidence, but readiness. Readiness to rebuild. Readiness to endure. Readiness to remember. And remembering was everything, because memory connected generations. It linked the living to the dead. It tied present labor to ancient beginnings. Without memory, work lost meaning. Without memory, ritual failed. Without memory, order unraveled. This is why the past was never distant in Sumerian life. It was active. It was authoritative. It was necessary. The first city mattered because it explained all others. The first kings mattered because they defined authority. The first catastrophe mattered because it set limits. Origins were not curiosities, they were foundations. And the Anunnaki, standing at the edge of all endings, reinforced this structure. They reminded everyone that no system lasted forever. Even the gods were bound by decrees. Even creation had limits. Even memory would eventually fade. This knowledge did not weaken Sumerian culture. It sharpened it. It forced attention. It demanded care. It discouraged excess. In a world where nothing was guaranteed, discipline became survival. This may be the most enduring lesson of all, that civilization is not an achievement, it is a practice, and practices must be repeated. Eventually, even repetition weakens. Canals fill with silt. Rituals lose precision. Words drift from their original meaning. The Sumerians understood this too. They did not believe order could be preserved indefinitely. They believed it could be delayed. Every generation held the line for a time. And then another generation took its place. This was enough. Perfection was never the goal. Continuation was, but continuation required effort, and effort required belief. When belief faded, structures followed, cities emptied slowly, temples fell quiet, names were spoken less often. The gods did not vanish suddenly, they receded. Their presence became symbolic, their rituals abbreviated, their authority absorbed into new systems, and still traces remained. A phrase copied without understanding, a ceremony performed out of habit, a calendar followed because it always had been. This is how civilizations dissolve, not in collapse alone, but in forgetting why things exist. The Sumerians feared this more than destruction. Destruction was visible. Forgetting was gradual. You could rebuild after a flood. You could not rebuild meaning once it was lost. This is why the tablets mattered. They were anchors, fixed points in time, reminders of origin. But even anchors erode. Languages shift, scripts change, readers disappear. Eventually the tablets themselves were buried, not intentionally, not ceremonially, simply covered by time. Soil accumulated, rivers shifted, cities rose elsewhere. And for centuries, millennia, the Sumerian world slept beneath the ground, unremembered, uninterpreted, silent. Until much later, hands uncovered the clay again. Not Sumerian hands, not believers, not priests, but strangers. People who did not worship these gods, who did not live by these rituals, who did not share these assumptions. And yet they read slowly, carefully, imperfectly. They pieced together fragments. They debated meanings. They argued over translations. The voices returned, not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough to know that something profound had been left behind. Not instruction, not warning, but testimony. Testimony that humanity once understood itself differently. That it once accepted limitation without resentment. That it once valued memory over ambition. That it once built meaning around endurance rather than transcendence. This is not nostalgia, it is contrast. And in that contrast, the Sumerian world speaks again, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily. It does not ask to be believed, it asks to be understood. And understanding does not require agreement, only attention. Rediscovery does not restore a world. It reveals how far away it truly is. When the buried tablets were lifted from the ground, when their markings were first noticed and later understood, the Sumerian world did not return to life. It emerged as an echo, incomplete, fragmented, filtered through unfamiliar eyes. The scribes who pressed those signs into clay never imagined this moment. They did not foresee scholars poring over fragments under electric light, debating grammar and context across continents. Their words were not written for us, and yet here they are, separated from belief, separated from ritual, separated from daily life. What remains is structure. We see how they organized reality, how they divided the cosmos, how they assigned meaning to labor, death, and memory. But we no longer live inside that system. We observe it. This distance matters. It reminds us that understanding is not the same as belonging. We can translate words but not experience. We can reconstruct myths but not inhabit them. The Sumerian universe was lived, not studied. Its gods were encountered through flood and drought, through illness and harvest, through silence and survival. Their presence was felt, not theorized. Modern readers approach these texts differently. We search for symbolism. We analyze patterns. We compare traditions. All of this reveals knowledge but not belief. And belief was the engine that kept the system running. Without belief, rituals become gestures. Without belief, gods become concepts. Without belief, memory becomes archive. This does not diminish the Sumerians, it clarifies them. They were not primitive thinkers awaiting correction. They were practical observers building meaning from what they faced. They did not imagine the world as safe. They did not expect justice. They did not assume continuity. They prepared for disruption. In doing so, they created a worldview resilient enough to be inherited, adapted, and remembered long after its original context vanished. This resilience is visible even now, in the way we still tell stories about beginnings, in the way we mark time, in the way we fear collapse. The Sumerian voice is not loud in these moments. It is implicit, a reminder that nothing lasts without care, that systems require attention, that forgetting is slow but irreversible. As this documentary continues to stretch across time, it does not move toward resolution. It settles, like sediment, like dust, like memory. The Sumerian world does not ask to be revived. It asks only to be acknowledged as one of humanity's earliest attempts to face reality without illusion. And that attempt, quiet and incomplete, still has something to say. Listening is not passive. It requires patience. It requires restraint. It requires the willingness to sit with what does not resolve. The Sumerian texts demand this kind of attention. They do not rush. They do not conclude neatly. They do not guide the reader toward comfort. They unfold slowly, often repetitively, circling the same truths from different angles: creation, order, labor, collapse, memory. These themes return because they never leave. The Sumerians did not imagine history as progress toward enlightenment. They imagined it as movement within boundaries, boundaries established at the beginning, boundaries reinforced by catastrophe, boundaries maintained through effort. To live well was to recognize those limits and operate within them. To ignore them was to invite correction. This is why humility appears repeatedly, not as virtue but as necessity. Humans were not small because the gods demanded it. They were small because reality required it. Arrogance disrupted balance. Excess strained systems. Forgetting weakened foundations. These were not moral failures, they were structural ones. And structural failures have consequences regardless of intent. The Sumerians accepted this without resentment. They did not curse the gods for indifference. They did not demand explanation beyond pattern. They did not expect the universe to justify itself. Instead, they adjusted. Adjustment became wisdom. This wisdom was not philosophical in the modern sense. It was procedural. It lived in calendars, rituals, work schedules, legal formulas. It told people when to plant, when to rest, when to offer, when to mourn. It did not ask why suffering existed. It asked how to continue despite it. And perhaps this is the most striking difference between ancient and modern narratives. We often seek meaning in outcome. They sought it in continuity. The Anunnaki, silent and final, framed this understanding. They represented the boundary that could not be negotiated, the place where effort ceased. Everything before that point mattered. Every action, every memory, every repetition. Not because it changed the ending, but because it filled the interval, and the interval was all that existed. This realization stripped life of illusion, but it also stripped it of distraction. When nothing is promised, attention sharpens. The present becomes significant, the past becomes instructive, the future becomes uncertain but manageable. This is the posture the Sumerians left behind, not despair, not hope, readiness. And readiness, once learned, can be passed on. As the distance between past and present widens, something subtle happens. The details blur, the edges soften, certainty gives way to impression. This is not loss, it is transformation. The Sumerian world no longer exists as a place. It exists as a rhythm felt more than understood, sensed rather than explained. It moves beneath later histories like a current under still water. We encounter it in assumptions we rarely question. That order must be maintained. That systems fail when neglected. That memory carries weight. These ideas did not originate with us. They were learned, and learning does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, passed from one structure to another, one tradition to the next, until its origin disappears. This is how influence endures, not through dominance, not through instruction, but through absorption. The Sumerians did not leave a message for the future. They left a posture, a way of standing in the world without expecting it to bend. That posture remains available, even now, in moments of uncertainty, in times of instability, in the awareness that systems, ecological, social, cultural, require care. Their worldview does not tell us what to believe, it shows us how they endured. They endured by observing patterns, by accepting limits, by repeating what worked. They endured by understanding that nothing lasts without effort, not cities, not rituals, not memory. Everything fades unless attended to. This understanding carries no drama. It does not warn, it does not threaten, it simply states. And in that statement there is calm, a calm born not from certainty but from familiarity with impermanence. The Sumerians lived with impermanence daily. Floods reminded them, droughts confirmed it, death enforced it. They did not escape this reality with fantasy. They met it with structure. Structure did not eliminate suffering, it organized it. It gave suffering a place, a reason, a boundary. And boundaries made life manageable. As this narration continues, as it stretches across time with no urgency to conclude, it mirrors that same principle. There is no destination here, only continuation, only attention, only the quiet acknowledgement that long before we asked what the universe meant, we first learned how to remain within it. And that lesson, once learned, does not expire. As time stretches outward and the present loosens its grip on certainty, the Sumerian world does not disappear so much as it dissolves into a deeper layer of awareness, becoming less a place that can be pointed to and more a way of recognizing how fragile all human arrangements ultimately are beneath the surface of daily life and assumed permanence. Their cities, once crowded with voices and labor and ritual sound, now exist only as impressions carried forward through soil, scholarship, and memory, reminding us that even the most carefully ordered systems eventually surrender to erosion, silence, and the slow patience of the earth that reclaims everything placed upon it. What remains most clearly is not the architecture, nor the names, nor even the gods themselves, but the posture these people adopted toward existence, a posture shaped by rivers that could not be controlled, by seasons that refused to be negotiated with, and by a cosmos that offered no reassurance beyond the patterns it repeated again and again across generations. They lived within limits without seeking to overcome them, and they organized their societies around the acceptance that survival depended less on ambition than on attentiveness, less on belief than on consistency, and less on hope than on the careful preservation of what had already proven capable of sustaining life in an unpredictable environment. The myths they told were not fantasies designed to distract from hardship, but frameworks that allowed hardship to be placed within a comprehensible structure, where suffering had precedent, collapse had explanation, and continuity remained possible as long as memory and ritual were maintained with sufficient care and seriousness. Even the gods, for all their power and authority, were not exempt from this structure, since they too operated within boundaries established at the beginning of creation, bound by decrees that could not be undone once spoken, reinforcing the idea that absolute freedom did not exist anywhere in the universe, whether mortal or divine. This understanding shaped every aspect of Sumerian life, from the way children were raised to respect tradition, to the way kings ruled with constant awareness of divine scrutiny, to the way scribes copied texts with meticulous attention, knowing that a single error could ripple outward into imbalance and uncertainty far beyond the tablet itself. In this world, meaning did not arrive through revelation or personal transformation, but through participation in an ongoing process that demanded repetition, patience, and humility, qualities that do not announce themselves dramatically, but reveal their strength only over long spans of time measured in generations rather than individual lifetimes. As modern viewers, separated by millennia and technology, and entirely different assumptions about progress and identity, we encounter these texts not as instructions to follow, but as evidence that humanity has long understood the cost of maintaining order in a universe that does not naturally provide it without effort and sacrifice. The Sumerians did not imagine themselves as the center of existence, nor did they believe the world was designed for their comfort, and in this refusal to flatter themselves, they developed a realism that allowed them to build something durable enough to echo forward even after their cities fell silent beneath layers of accumulated earth. This durability was never guaranteed, and they knew it, which is why their stories do not end with triumph or resolution, but with continuation constrained by limits that must be respected if anything is to endure at all. And so, as the voice of this documentary continues without urgency toward conclusion, it reflects the same understanding that shaped those earliest writings, allowing space for stillness, for reflection, and for the recognition that not every journey requires a destination in order to carry meaning across time. As the voice moves forward without urgency, and without the need to arrive anywhere in particular, it begins to mirror the way time itself was understood by the earliest writers, not as something rushing toward fulfillment, but as a slow accumulation of moments that only gained meaning through repetition, attention, and the quiet persistence of human effort against forces that could never be fully mastered. The Sumerians lived inside this awareness every day, shaped by horizons that rarely changed and by rivers that changed too much, learning early that stability was never a natural state of the world, but a temporary condition achieved through constant labor, shared memory, and an unspoken agreement to uphold inherited patterns, even when their original reasons had begun to fade from conscious understanding. In such a world, identity was not something discovered inwardly or declared individually, but something assigned through position, obligation, and relationship, binding each person into a wider structure that extended backward into myth and forward into uncertainty, held together not by belief alone, but by the daily reenactment of roles that kept the larger system functioning. To wake at dawn, to work the land, to maintain canals, to present offerings, to observe the sky, and to repeat the same motions year after year was not monotony, but alignment, a way of remaining in harmony with forces that could not be reasoned with but could sometimes be anticipated through careful attention and inherited knowledge. This is why innovation carried risk, because deviation introduced instability, and instability threatened the fragile equilibrium that allowed life to continue in a landscape where one failed season could undo years of careful preparation and communal cooperation. The gods, as they appear in these ancient narratives, were not symbols of moral perfection or sources of personal comfort, but representations of pressure, consequence, and scale, reminders that the world operated according to principles far larger than individual desire, and that survival required negotiation rather than defiance. Even compassion, when it appeared among the gods, was pragmatic rather than sentimental, as seen in moments where destruction was tempered not because it was unjust, but because it was inefficient, revealing a worldview in which mercy existed only insofar as it preserved functionality within the broader system. This perspective does not lend itself easily to modern expectations, which often seek meaning through individuality, progress, and transcendence. Yet it offers something equally valuable by grounding existence in responsibility, continuity, and the acceptance that limits are not obstacles to meaning, but the conditions that make meaning possible in the first place. As centuries passed and the Sumerian language itself gave way to others, this foundational posture did not vanish, but quietly embedded itself into administrative habits, legal frameworks, religious assumptions, and cultural rhythms that continued to shape human societies long after the original names and stories were no longer spoken aloud. What we encounter now, looking back across that vast distance, is not a lost civilization waiting to be revived, but a mirror held up to our own uncertainties, reflecting the same questions about stability, memory, and collapse that continue to surface whenever systems strain under their own weight. And so the narration does not hurry, because there is nowhere it needs to go, allowing each thought to unfold fully and settle into place, much like sediment carried by slow-moving water, layering meaning gradually rather than announcing it through sudden revelation or dramatic conclusion. In this space, where past and present overlap without fully merging, the Sumerian world remains not as a destination, but as a reminder that long before humanity imagined progress without limits, it first learned how to endure within them, shaping a legacy that persists not through spectacle, but through quiet persistence across deep and patient time. As the flow of this account continues, it begins to resemble the slow movement of the rivers themselves, carrying fragments of memory forward not in a straight or decisive line, but in wide, deliberate curves that gather meaning through duration rather than speed, allowing ideas to settle gradually instead of forcing them toward immediate clarity. The Sumerians lived with this kind of time pressing gently but constantly against them, a time measured not by urgency or expectation, but by accumulation, where the weight of what had already occurred shaped every decision more powerfully than speculation about what might come next. To them, the past was not something left behind, but something layered beneath the present, supporting it unevenly, sometimes reliably, sometimes dangerously, requiring careful attention so that cracks did not widen unnoticed beneath the surface of daily life and familiar routine. This awareness cultivated a mindset that favored caution over optimism and continuity over transformation, encouraging societies to invest energy not in imagining radically different futures, but in ensuring that the fragile present could be extended just a little longer without tipping into disorder. In such a worldview, endurance became a quiet form of wisdom, expressed not through dramatic gestures or heroic defiance, but through consistency, patience, and the willingness to perform the same necessary actions repeatedly, even when their immediate purpose was no longer fully understood by those carrying them out. The rituals persisted because they worked, the stories endured because they explained, and the structures remained because abandoning them would have meant exposing the community to uncertainties far more dangerous than monotony or restraint ever could be. Even the inevitability of decline was not treated as a tragedy in itself, but as part of the same cycle that had always governed existence, reinforcing the idea that collapse did not invalidate what came before it, but merely confirmed the limits within which all human effort must operate. This acceptance allowed the Sumerians to face impermanence without panic, understanding that nothing built by human hands was meant to escape time, but that meaning could still be found in the act of building, maintaining, and preserving for as long as circumstances allowed. As modern observers, accustomed to narratives that seek resolution and closure, this refusal to offer a final answer may feel unsettling. Yet it is precisely this openness, this willingness to let understanding remain incomplete, that gives the Sumerian worldview its enduring relevance across millennia of changing assumptions. The absence of a definitive conclusion does not signify failure, but recognition, an acknowledgement that existence does not resolve itself neatly, and that expecting it to do so only creates dissatisfaction where acceptance might otherwise have allowed stability. And so the narration continues in this same spirit, not pressing toward an ending, but remaining present within the unfolding moment, echoing the earliest attempts of humanity to situate itself within a world that could not be controlled, only understood well enough to endure. And so, as this long journey through humanity's earliest written memory finally settles into stillness, what remains is not a secret uncovered or a mystery solved, but a perspective quietly restored, reminding us that the people who first pressed meaning into clay were not searching for escape from reality, but for a way to remain within it without illusion, without denial, and without the expectation that existence owed them anything beyond the chance to endure. They understood, perhaps more clearly than many who came after them, that life does not resolve itself into clarity or justice or triumph, but unfolds within boundaries that demand attention, discipline, and remembrance, and that meaning is not discovered at the end of a journey, but sustained moment by moment through care, repetition, and responsibility in the face of inevitable change. The Sumerians did not imagine a universe built for human fulfillment, yet they built a civilization anyway, knowing it would not last forever, knowing it would eventually dissolve back into the same earth from which it rose, and still choosing to maintain order for as long as their hands and memories allowed, which may be the most honest definition of wisdom ever recorded. They teach us that survival is not victory, that continuity is not permanence, and that dignity does not require hope, only clarity and the willingness to stand within reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be, accepting limits not as punishment, but as the conditions that make existence possible at all. And if these ancient voices still resonate, if their quiet realism still feels relevant in a world that struggles with uncertainty and instability of its own, then perhaps it is because the questions they faced have never truly left us, only changed their form while remaining rooted in the same fragile ground. Before we part, take a moment to share in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now, because across distance and culture and centuries, this shared curiosity is what keeps memory alive rather than buried. If this journey has brought value, reflection, or perspective, consider subscribing so you can join the next exploration when it arrives, as we continue moving slowly through the deep past, listening carefully to what remains when the noise fades and only meaning endures. Until then, let the silence settle, let the ancient world rest once more, and stay tuned for the next chapter in our exploration of humanity's earliest attempts to understand itself and the world it inhabits.